Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in Argentina and to ask the question as to whether or not Javier Milei's rock and roll politics are working. Now, if you follow the channel, you'll be aware that Javier Milei is a very colourful character. He came to prominence during the presidential election, and he came from being an outside candidate to being the President of Argentina in a very short space of time. In fact, this is a guy who's only actually been in politics for around 2 years. So let's have a look at some of the highlights from his campaign. So as I said, quite a colourful character. And one of the reasons why he was voted into power is that the people in Argentina were sick of the politicians running Argentina into the ground. This is a country that's had 6 recessions in the past 10 years, and historically it's defaulted on its international debt obligations on 9 separate occasions. And the problems in Argentina have been building for years. This isn't something that's going to be easy to fix. So Javier Milei came into power and said that he was going to do things in a radical manner. And over the past 8 months, he has been doing that. So he's reduced subsidies that were previously being provided for things like gas, electric and public services to all of the people in Argentina. And there's been a significant increase in the costs that people are having to pay. As you can see from this graphic, the average that people were paying for public services in December 23 was 30,000 Argentinian pesos. Today they're paying over 140,000 pesos for those same services. So that represents an increase of almost 5 times. And it's not just subsidies that Javier Milei has cut back on, he's also reduced the number of government departments by around 50%. In this video that he posted in August 23 during his presidential campaign, he was famously shown as throwing lots of government departments off the wall to close them down, and he's followed through with those promises. He's done that. He's also cut back significantly on public spending on things like education and housing and hospitals and a variety of other things. And so he's doing what he said he was going to do. And he said at the time that things would get worse before they got better. And we've definitely seen that happening over the course of the past 6 or 7 months. But in today's video, I want to go through exactly where Argentina is today, what things like taxes, the balance of trade, the fiscal balance are looking like, where we are with regards to inflation and interest rates, and what's happening with the Argentine peso. And at the end of today's video, I'll give you my assessment as to whether or not I think Javier Milei is on the right track, or if he's overcooked it, if he's doing things that are too aggressive for the Argentine economy to be able to cope with, and if he is, what's likely to happen to Argentina over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you've signed up as a Patreon or a YouTube member or a Buy Me a Coffee member, thank you so much for that long-term support. Really appreciate it. And if you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks recently, thank you so much for the time and effort and the generosity involved in that. Really means a lot to me. This chart shows the total amount collected by the Argentinian government for tax revenues over the past 12 months. And the scale on the right-hand side of this chart is shown in trillions of Argentine pesos. And what this shows is that in July 2023, the total amount of taxes gathered in by the Argentinian government was 3.6 trillion pesos, which equates to around 3.6 billion US dollars. And you can see that in the following 4 months, in the run-in to the election that took place in December 2024, tax revenues increased, and by December 2023, they'd risen to 5.9 trillion pesos. However, if we now look at what's happened since President Milei took over, you can see that there has been a sharp increase in the total amount of tax that Argentina is receiving, and the latest figures for July 2024 show that the government collected 11.9 trillion pesos, which is more than 3 times the amount that was collected in July 2023. So what this chart shows us is that Milei is focused on increasing taxes and making sure that the government has as much money as possible in order to pay for all of the things that it needs to invest into. And if we widen the scale of this chart to show what's been happening over the past 5 years, you can start to understand the problems that are being experienced in Argentina right now, because the level of tax revenues has been growing at a very slow rate historically. Back in August 2019, the total amount that was collected in by the Argentinian government was 458 billion pesos. And by the end of December 2022, that figure had only risen to 2.3 trillion pesos. Now you can see that between December 2023 and December 2024, there was an increase, and it increased to the 5.9 trillion that we've just looked at. However, the most rapid increase has taken place during Javier Milei's presidency. And if you take a step back, you can see that there's been a marked change in the level of increase in taxes. Now, obviously, that's good news from a big picture economic perspective. It's good that the government has more money. However, from a personal point of view, from people on the ground, obviously it's bad news because they're having to pay more taxes. Corporates and individuals in Argentina are going to have to pay for the reconstruction of the economy, and that's going to be painful in the short term. This chart shows the quarterly amount spent by the Argentine government over the past 3 years. And what this chart shows is that in the period between Q1 2021 and the fourth quarter of 2023, there was a progressive increase in the total amount that the Argentine government was spending. Now, if you look at the individual movement of each year, you can see that there's an element of seasonality. We haven't got a constant increase here. There are quarters when expenditure increased significantly, and then it came back down in the following quarter. However, if you take a step back and have a look at the overall trend between the start of 2021 and the end of 2023, there was a significant increase. However, if we now look at the first quarter of 2024, which was the first quarter that Javier Milei was in charge, there has been a significant reduction. And the expenditure in the first quarter of 2024 is the lowest out of all of the quarters. This chart, which is a very trendy graphic that was put together by Bloomberg, shows the fiscal balance for Argentina. And the fiscal balance is basically the difference between the income that the government is collecting in, so all of those taxes that we just looked at, and all of the money that the government is spending. And what you can see from this chart is that in the 12 months from January to December 2023, Argentina was in the red. It was spending more money than it was earning. And obviously, that is a major problem, because if you're constantly spending more money than you've got to spend, then you're going to cause yourselves major problems. You're going to have to draw down more debt. And debt has been a persistent problem for Argentina over the past 100 years or so. Historically, Argentina has defaulted on its debt obligations on 9 separate occasions and has defaulted 3 times since 2001. So having a negative fiscal balance is seriously bad news. But if we look at the situation for 2024, since Javier Milei took over, you can see that Argentina has been in the black in every single month. So it's spending less than it's earning. And that's obviously a good thing, because it means that Argentina can get back onto an even keel. It can start building up some cash and being able to do things the right way, rather than having to borrow more and more money constantly and running the risk of a default. If you can build up a cash surplus, obviously that's beneficial for the economy overall. But one of the accusations that's been targeted against Javier Milei is that he has been too severe with the cutbacks, and those cutbacks are now causing problems in terms of loss of jobs, loss of income, and therefore potentially could mean that Argentina goes into a deep recession for a long period of time. It's one thing cutting spending to enable you to have a positive fiscal balance. However, if you're damaging the economy, then clearly that is not going to be good news in the long term. This chart shows the balance of trade for Argentina over the past 12 months. And if you follow the channel, you'll know that the balance of trade is basically the difference between the value of all of your exports and the cost of all of your imports. So basically it tells you whether a country is spending more than it's earning or earning more than it's spending. And what we can see here is a very clear trend. In the 5 months from July to November 2023, Argentina was running a negative balance of trade. So basically it was paying more for its imports than it was receiving for its exports. However, over the past 7 months, that position has completely reversed. So if we have a look at the figures involved here, in July 2023, the balance of trade was minus $700 million US dollars. The deficit actually increased to around $1 billion US dollars in August. By November, the deficit was around $560 million US dollars. However, by December, which was the month when Javier Milei took over as president, Argentina reported a positive balance of trade of $1 billion, representing a turnaround of $1.5 billion in 1 month. And as you can see, over the following 5 months, there was a progressive improvement in the balance of trade. And in May 24, Argentina reported a $2.7 billion positive position. Now, over the past couple of months, that has actually reduced. And the most recent figure for July 24 was positive $1.6 billion. So when you take a step back and look at this, it looks like a remarkable turnaround. It looks like Javier Milei has really put Argentina back on track to getting in control of its finances. However, as with anything, the devil is in the detail. We need to establish exactly how Argentina has managed to turn its deficit into a positive situation in such a short space of time. And the simple answer to that question is that Argentina has significantly reduced the amount of goods that it's importing. In July 2024, the value of goods imported was down by 16.5%, with the most significant reduction being in fuels, which are down by almost 34%. So what this chart is showing us is that Javier Milei is trying to get control of the economy by cutting costs and reducing spending rather than increasing income and trying to grow the economy. This chart shows the movement in monthly inflation in Argentina. So basically what we're looking at here is the change in prices from 1 month to another. So this isn't the annual inflation rate, which is the rate that we normally look at when we're talking about inflation. And the reason I wanted to show this is really to have a look at what's going on within each month to get a feel for whether or not Javier Milei is getting on top of what's going on with inflation. What this chart shows is that in July 2023, monthly inflation was running at 6.3%. So that means that basically prices had risen in July by 6% against the prices for June 2023. So this isn't the annual rate of inflation. This is simply the increase within 30 or 31 days. So obviously, if prices are going up by 6%, that represents a serious problem. However, they increased by 12.4% in August and a further 12.7% in September. And this is why the annual rate of inflation in Argentina is significantly above 200%. And we'll come on to look at what the actual year-on-year movement in inflation is in a moment. Now, as we've discussed, Javier Milei took over as President of Argentina in December. And in that month, the monthly increase in prices was 25.5%. And if you annualise that rate, it would equate to inflation of more than 300%. Now, if we look at what's happened since Javier Milei took over as president, you can see that there has been a significant and marked reduction in the monthly rate of inflation. It fell to 20.6% in January, 13.2% in February, 11% in March, 8.8% in April, 4.3% in May, bounced up a little bit to 4.6% in June, and the most recent figures for July 2024 show that monthly inflation is now down to 4%, which in relative terms is a good outcome compared to the 25% that was being experienced in December. Now, obviously, in real terms, in real money terms, a monthly increase of 4% would equate to annual inflation of more than 50%. So that's still off the scale in comparison to most countries' inflation. But what we are seeing here is a definite trend for inflation slowing down. And that's really one of the points to make here when you look at this chart. Inflation is still rising. It's going up by 4% per month. So prices are still rising. When we discuss reducing inflation, it doesn't mean that prices are going down. It means that they're going up at a slower rate. This chart shows the annual rate of inflation in Argentina over the past 12 months. And one thing to note about this chart is that the scale on the right-hand side doesn't start at 0. It actually starts at 100% and goes up to 340%. So all of these bars are above 100%. If we look at the situation back in July 2023, annual inflation was running at more than 113%, and it continued increasing in the final 5 months of 2023, and by the time Javier Milei was appointed as president, the annual rate of inflation was 211%. Now, as we've just discussed, since Javier Milei took over, the monthly increase in inflation has started coming down. However, inflation itself continued to rise for the first 4 months that Javier Milei was in charge, and by April 2024 it was up to 292%, which was the highest rate in the whole world at that point. Now, over the past 3 months there has been a slight reduction in the annual rate of inflation, and the figure for July of 263% is almost 20% lower than the figure for April. However, as you can see from this chart, 263% is still the highest rate of inflation in the whole world. In fact, it's the only country that's in the 200s, and the only other country globally that has inflation of more than 100% is Syria, which is a war-torn country. And the country with the third highest rate of inflation in the world is Turkey, with around 62%, which is more than 200% less than it is in Argentina. So even though we are seeing a positive trend, the month-on-month inflation figure is coming down. Javier Milei is doing something to move the economy in the right direction. It isn't coming down fast enough, and Argentina is still an outlier in terms of the total inflation in the country. And the current rate of inflation is significantly more than countries such as Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Iran, Cuba, Haiti, and Egypt, all of which are in varying states of economic crisis. So this really puts into perspective how serious the situation is in Argentina right now. This chart shows the movement in the official rate of interest in Argentina over the past 3 years. And if you follow the channel, you'll know that there's usually an intrinsic relationship between interest rates and inflation. And the central bank in most countries tries to manage inflation by moving interest rates. So usually when there's times of high inflation, a central bank would look to increase its interest rates to discourage companies and individuals from borrowing. That usually then results in a reduction in demand, and a reduction in demand usually results in a reduction in prices, so inflation comes back down. That's the logic. Now, if we look at the situation in Argentina when Javier Milei took over as president, interest rates at that point were at 126%, which was the highest level in the whole of the world. And as you can see, over the previous 12 months, there had been a number of interest rate increases. Now, if we look at the situation since Javier Milei took over as president, you can see that Argentina has been reducing its interest rates rapidly, and the current rate is now 40%. So that represents a reduction of 86 percentage points over the past 8 months or so. Now, that defies logic in terms of what I've just discussed. Usually at times of high inflation, you would expect interest rates to be increasing. However, that strategy was clearly not working over the previous 12 months because interest rates rose to 126%. And as we've just discussed, inflation over that same period increased from around 113% to almost 300%. And the reason why the increase in interest rates didn't bring inflation back under control is that there is now a disconnect between the two metrics as a result of the fact that a lot of people in Argentina have lost faith in the Argentinian currency, the peso, and are now using the US dollar instead. So basically, people are no longer borrowing in pesos, so it doesn't really matter if the central bank increases interest rates. It doesn't put off anybody from taking out loans because nobody was going to do it anyway, because the peso is falling in value so rapidly. And just to put the current interest rate of 40% into perspective, this chart shows the countries with the highest rates of interest in the world. And as you can see, there are currently only 2 countries with higher rates of interest: Venezuela, where interest rates are over 59%, and Turkey, where they're 50%. and I've talked about both of those countries at length in previous videos. They are both in a state of economic crisis. Argentina is number 3 on this list, and the next highest rate of inflation is in Ghana at 29%, followed by Egypt, Nigeria, Malawi, Congo, Sierra Leone, Iran, Lebanon, Liberia, Zimbabwe, Angola, Pakistan, and Russia. So that really puts into perspective just how serious the situation is in Argentina, despite the fact that it's reduced its interest rates rapidly over the past 8 months. It's still one of the highest in the world, and it tells us that the problems are not going away anytime soon. This chart shows the movement in the official exchange rate between the US dollar and the Argentine peso over the past 12 months. And when you look at this chart, it does look very unusual, doesn't it? And the reason for that is because Argentina is managing its exchange rate. The official exchange rate is not floating, it's not set by the markets. The Argentine government is setting this price. So that's why we are looking at a very unusual chart. Now, if we look at the situation before Javier Milei took over, $1 was officially trading for 376 pesos. However, one of the first things that Milei did when he took over was to devalue the currency, and he reset the official exchange rate to just under 800 to $1. Now, over the past 8 months, you can see that there's been a continued reduction in the value of the peso, and this is planned by the Argentine government. They are continuing to reduce the official exchange rate. However, the current rate of $1 to 945 pesos still does not reflect the true market value of the peso. We can only see that by looking at the black market rate. This chart shows the black market rate, or the blue dollar rate as it's referred to in Argentina, which is basically the rate at which pesos trade for on the streets of Argentina. And as you can see, the current rate for $1 is 1,350 pesos, which is around 30% worse than the official rate. And the problem that Argentina has is that as it continues to reduce its official rate, the blue dollar rate also deteriorates as well. So there's always a gap, which means that people do not want to use the peso. They don't want to be paid in pesos. They don't want to hold their savings in peso. Everybody is much more comfortable with US dollars. And that's why there's a disconnect between interest rates and inflation, and also why inflation continues to rise, because people are wanting to use dollars rather than pesos. So the peso is continuing to devalue, therefore it can buy less in the international markets. Imports are more expensive, therefore they push up prices, they push up inflation, and it becomes a very difficult cycle to break. This chart shows the unemployment rate in Argentina over the past 3 years, and the figures here are shown for each quarter. And what this shows is that in the period between the second quarter of 2021 and the fourth quarter of 2023, there was a continued reduction in the rate of unemployment. Back in the second quarter of 2021, unemployment was running at 9.6%. It then came down to 8.2%, and over the following 9 quarters, there was a continued reduction, and by the end of 2023, unemployment was sitting at 5.7%. And if we expand the scale of this chart to show the position over the past 25 years, you can see that that was the lowest level that Argentina had experienced at any point during that period. So that in theory, you would say, well, that represents a good thing. If unemployment is low, the country must be doing well. However, as we've discussed many times before, statistics can be misleading. And one of the things that Javier Milei wanted to target as part of his presidency was that there were far too many people being employed, particularly by the state in governmental positions, and he wanted to reduce all of that expenditure. So one of the things that he did as soon as he took over was to close down a lot of government departments. We saw the video of him pulling things off the wall earlier in today's video. And the figures for the first quarter of 2024, which is the first quarter that we've seen reported since Javier Milei took over, show that unemployment is now up to 7.7%, which is the highest that it's been since the third quarter of 2021. So what we're seeing here is that the policies that are being implemented by Javier Milei are resulting in mass redundancies, particularly of people who were previously employed by the state. Now, that might be good in terms of reducing your spending and bringing things like the fiscal balance back under control, But what isn't good is that people are being put out of work. So they're no longer earning, they're not being paid as much. And so those people will now be joining the many others in Argentina who are struggling to be able to afford enough food. And this overall doesn't represent a solid start in terms of putting the economy back on track. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's happening in Argentina is absolutely fascinating, because this is a country that's been in long-term decline. In fact, over the past 100 years, it's defaulted on its international debt on 9 separate occasions, and it's had 6 recessions in the past 10 years. So that's really as bad as it gets. And we've seen consistently different presidents coming and going, people with new ideas and policies never actually being able to turn the country around. And I think that's one of the reasons why Javier Milei was actually voted in as president. He got around 56% of the vote, and it's reported that he's still remaining as that popular. That's basically where he is today. So everybody is still supporting Milei 8 months into the job. And what we've seen from today's video is that there have actually been some major steps forward. When you look at what's been going on with the fiscal balance, Argentina is now back in the black. It's actually spending less than it's receiving, so it can afford to make all of those payments. So that's absolutely great. And it's the same with the balance of trade. The level of imports and exports are now balanced to the point where Argentina is making a profit. It's spending less on its imports than it's earning from its exports. In addition to that, the monthly increases in inflation have come down significantly from over 25% when Milei took over to around 4% today. And the official interest rate has also come down from 126% to 40%. So all of that represents potential good news. It all looks like things are moving in the right direction. However, we need to look into exactly what the implications of all of this are for the economy. And what we've seen from today's video is that Javier Milei has started off his presidential term by looking at the costs. So he's reducing all of the costs. So he's cut back on expenditure, he's cut back on imports, he's cut back on the number of people employed directly by the state. And all of that is helping put everything back into the black because Argentina is spending less. However, in order to get out of the current situation, Argentina needs to start earning more. It needs more income to be able to pay for all of the essential services. And there is a risk when you look at what's been going on that Javier Milei has cut back too aggressively. And we're now starting to see things like unemployment rising rapidly. And that is going to be bad news for the long-term growth of the Argentine economy, because in order to grow, they need people to be in jobs earning money to be able to then spend. All of the companies can then sell more products, and all of that leads to good long-term healthy growth. But what we're seeing in Argentina right now is the cost cutting and the cutting back on public services is meaning more people are out of work at a time when inflation is still running at more than 250%. Argentina is off the scale compared to the rest of the world for its inflation. So things are becoming less and less affordable every single day in Argentina. And the more people that are put out of work, the more are going to be put into the poverty trap where they literally won't be able to afford to buy enough food. So I don't think Argentina is anywhere near out of the woods yet. Javier Milei has, as he said, cut back on a lot of expenditure. So he's reduced the amount that Argentina is spending. But what he really needs to do is get the economy fired up and growing. It needs to start expanding. People need to start finding employment. Companies need to start growing to get their export markets going. And they also need to get inflation back down to a manageable level. And 250% is nowhere near manageable. 200% isn't, 100% isn't, 50% isn't. It needs to be down to somewhere in the region of 20 or 30%, which obviously is still very high. And Argentina is a million miles away from getting to that point. So I think the overall summary of today's video is that Javier Milei came in a blaze of glory. He said he was going to do things radically. He started off doing exactly as he said. He's made all of these cutbacks. He's reduced the expenditure of Argentina. But what he really needs to do is get growth into the economy. And he needs to do that rapidly, because the longer this situation persists, the worse it's going to get for more and more people. And there is a real risk that his popularity will start to dwindle. And if that happens, then he may have to leave power. And if he did, then somebody else would come in and take over. And it looks currently like Argentina is on a knife edge. If Javier Milei can start the growth, if he can start getting things going in the economy, then he has a chance of being able to turn things around. But unfortunately for him, he's facing a very long history of problems in Argentina. And those problems are very difficult to fix. He's having a go. He's doing his best. He's trying to turn things around. We're seeing some green shoots of recovery, but nowhere near enough to tell us that Argentina will get back onto an even keel at some point in the future. So I think the outlook for the next 3 to 6 months is that it's still going to be very, very tough in Argentina. We're likely to see inflation continuing to be high. Interest rates will be high. We're probably going to see rising unemployment. The fiscal balance and the balance of trade may well be in the black. But if you're not spending enough to grow the economy, that really isn't good for the long-term prospects for Argentina. So I'll keep you posted on news and developments as and when they happen. Hopefully you found today's video useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. And here's something to put a smile on your face.